seminar today. Okay, so thanks so much everyone for coming to online Causal Inference seminar. Today we are excited to have Corwin Zigler from Brown University. He's going to talking about causal health impacts of power plant emission controls and the model and uncertain physical process interference. And we have a discussion from Fredrik Sävje from Uppsala University afterwards. And today In is going to handle the questions. So In.
Thank you, Naoki. So as usual, please submit your questions in the Q&A section for us to track the questions more easily. It's at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we will raise some quick clarification questions to the speaker during the talk or when our speaker stops for questions. And finally, we encourage you to submit your question as soon as you have them, instead of waiting for us to ask for questions. So without further ado, the stage is yours. Corwin.
All right, thank you, everybody. Let me get my screen back up. And then I'll view. All right, do we seem okay with the screen here? Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the chance to come and share some of my work with this audience in particular, and thanks, Fredrik, for agreeing to be the discussant. So I'll talk today about some work in Bayesian causal inference with physical process interference. This is joint with Nathan Weichel, who is an assistant professor at the University of Iowa, who really led this work. So if you don't like it, you can email him. And if you do like it, you can send your compliments directly to me. So if I can advance the slides here, we can get going here. So I want to start with a little bit of background on the problem that motivated this work, which has to do with power plants, air pollution, and health. So air pollution is bad for you. I'm not really going to dwell on that point. I will point out here that air pollution means lots of different things. But for this talk, we're mostly focusing on PM 2.5. This fine particulate air pollution. It can get into your lungs and make you sick. That's really all I'll say about that. But we'll see this PM 2.5 denoted throughout the talk. The other thing that I like to start these talks with sometimes is to give some sense of the scale of these issues as a public health problem. So this is kind of an old table by now that's produced by the Office of Management and Budget, where they tabulate the costs and benefits of all federal regulations. These are in billions of dollars. And I've highlighted down here the row of this table. That's the Office of Air and Radiation. This is mostly the air pollution regulations. And so if you just look at the scale of those numbers in that highlighted row compared to the others, just trying to impress upon you that the air pollution regulations are by far the most costly and the most beneficial federal regulations in the US. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the scale of the problems we're trying to make progress on here. And then there's another point I like to make by way of introduction, which again, for this audience might be fairly obvious, but there is a distinction in sort of air pollution epidemiology, I would say, between trying to characterize the effects of pollution exposure versus trying to characterize the effects of policies or the effects of actions taken to reduce that pollution exposure. Again, this I don't think is a distinction that's lost on an audience like this, but the more traditional epidemiologic questions here are often about, what are the causal effects of exposure to air pollution? And so this is really about sort of like estimating something like an exposure response curve. That's not what I'm going to talk about. I'll be focused more on what I've called source-oriented regulatory questions, which are questions about what are the effects of exposures to pollution from specific sources of air pollution, what is the effect of intervening on specific sources of air pollutions, how does intervening at one source of air pollution spill over to affect health at other locations. Those are the types of questions that I've been trying to frame thinking around. And so the source of air pollution that I'll focus on for this work and have been focusing on for a few years now is coal power plants. So these are major sources of air pollution globally, not so much in the US anymore. The story of coal power plants goes something like this, and this is going to start to become important for the statistical methods development, is that when coal is burnt to generate electricity, lots of stuff comes out into the atmosphere, sort of comes out of the smokestack. And that's depicted here in the picture. One of the main things that comes out as a byproduct of burning coal is sulfur dioxide pollution. So that comes out of the smokestack. But then what happens is what's called the secondary formation of ambient PM 2.5. And this becomes an important part of the methods development here, which is that stuff, that SO2 comes out of the smokestack, it starts to blow around and react with other things in the atmosphere and move and eventually form into particles, these fine particles. In particular, it forms into the ambient sulfate pollution. But so the part I'm trying to impress upon you is the stuff comes out of the smokestack, it starts to blow around in the atmosphere. We understand a little bit about how that works. And then eventually it forms into the particles that are associated with all of that health burden. That's kind of the cartoonish version of the story. So there are a lot of questions about the health impacts and environmental justice associated with the emissions from coal power plants specifically. And so we have some work just to give you, again, more motivation for why looking at coal power plants has been important. I have this highlighted statement from the abstract, the second part of which says exposure to coal PM 2.5 was associated with 2.1 times greater mortality risk than exposure to PM 2.5 from other sources. That was 460,000 Medicare deaths over like a 20-year period. So this is all to say there's also evidence that not all of these particles are the same. And there's some evidence that the ones from coal combustion are particularly harmful to human health. So that's, again, part of the background for focusing on these types of problems. Okay, so to be a little bit more specific about the causal inference question we'll try to address for this talk, there are lots of regulatory interventions to attempt to reduce emissions from coal power plants. So one of them is that these plants can install what's called a scrubber. The idea of a scrubber installed on a coal power plant is to reduce the amount of SO2 that ends up in the atmosphere. So the story would go, the scrubber goes on, that means there's less SO2 emitted. That means there's less stuff blowing around in the atmosphere, which means there are less particles, which means there should be some improvement to health. That's the overall story. The specific question we'll try to target for the purposes of this talk is, how do scrubbers on coal-fired power plants causally affect pediatric asthma emergency department visits in Texas, for example? That's one question we'll answer. So here is my animation that's meant to give you some idea of what I mean when I say this stuff blows around in the atmosphere. So it's depicted on the left here is a red dot representing a power plant outside of Atlanta. And all of those colored dots moving around the eastern US there are supposed to represent where the air that starts at that power plant goes. So this is meant to give you some idea of the spatial scale here when I say this stuff moves across the atmosphere. In principle, if we intervene to reduce the emissions at that single red dot, that affects the air anywhere where those colored dots are moving, in principle, right? And so this is what's going to, if we intervene at one point location, it might have some impact that spills over quite a large spatial area. And so again, this is what's going to lead us to frame this as a problem for making inference on a network of interconnected power plant locations and then population locations where people live. And this is what gives rise to the idea of causal inference with interference in this context. So the study domain we'll talk about here is a study of health in Texas. And so we have data for this investigation, at least, on about 100 power plants located in this region of the United States. Some of those power plants install scrubbers, some of them don't. And we measure health at population locations, which in this case will be zip codes, measured across the state of Texas. So there's a couple thousand of those zip codes where we'll measure like the rate of visits to the emergency department for asthma. So we want to know how intervening on these dots impacts health across these locations here. So in terms of outlining the methods development, I'll try to unspool here as we go, is the first thing we're going to do is formalize potential outcomes and causal estimands in this setting, which I'll spend some time on. And then we're going to talk a lot about methods to characterize the structure of the interference here, because we're going to have an interference in this context that's driven by this physical chemical process of air pollution transport, of pollution moving through the atmosphere. And I'll focus on a statistical approach to this problem versus a more engineering approach, which I'll just say a couple words about. And then after we talk about characterizing the structure of the interference, we'll talk about methods for actually estimating causal effects in this setting, which will use Bayesian nonparametric regression trees that will propagate the uncertainty we have in the structure of the interference into our estimates of causal effects of asthma emergency department visits and all-cause mortality in Texas. So that's the sort of overall outline here. I can stop here if there were any questions, Ying, about the just the general background.
Hi, Corwin. Thank you for asking. So far, we don't have active questions. Yeah.
All right, great. So I'll full speed ahead here about formulating potential outcomes. So this is one example of what is sometimes called, or at least we've called, bipartite causal inference with interference, where we have this structure that has these two components to it. First, a bipartite structure where we have interventions happening on one type of observational unit. Those are power plants that gets a scrubber or they don't get a scrubber. And then we want to measure outcomes on some other observational unit. Here will be zip codes where there's like an emergency department visit rate. So that's the bipartite structure. There's nothing particularly unique about that structure, I don't think, but we're going to combine that with interference where we have outcomes for any given unit are actually going to depend upon the treatments that are assigned to multiple other units. Where this interconnectedness between these two types of observational units, again, is going to be governed by this physical process. That's what we're going for. And so this is a little basic for an audience like this, but I'm just kind of sort of, again, cartoonishly build up what we're going to do here. So if we start talking about potential outcomes, the most standard formulation we would have is comparing, for the ith unit, the potential outcome if that unit were treated versus the potential outcome if that unit were not treated, right? Stable unit treatment value assumption delivers us this familiar setting where there are exactly two potential outcomes for each unit, what would happen if it were treated and what would happen if it were not treated. So that's not really going to fit the problem that we're dealing with here. So the first sort of expansion to that is this bipartite nature of the problem. So I'll add in red things that are expanding upon the standard formulation. So the bipartite formulation means we have two different indices here. We have to index the power plants separately from indexing the zip codes. So we can go down here to our potential outcomes, and we can still define the potential outcome for the ith zip code as indexed by the treatment status of the jth power plant. So we can still do that, but we confront this question of like, well, which J goes with which I here? We're not, in this setting, there's no kind of automatic or self-evidence correspondence between which zip code goes with which power plant. And so this is not going to get us exactly where we need to be here. The next thing we could do is we can say, well, forget about anything that looks like the stable unit treatment value assumption, and we say the potential outcome for the ith zip code depends on the entire vector of treatment assignments at all J power plants. So here's where the problem explodes in your face, because now we have 2 to the power J possible potential outcomes. So it's a little bit hard to make progress here too. And so what we're going to do is adopt this approach based on exposure mapping. I'll say more about this, where we're going to express the dependence between potential outcomes and treatments, not in terms of this vector of treatment assignments itself, but some function of the vector of treatment assignments that will be indexed by the assignment of those treatments, and then some network adjacency matrix, which I'll call T here. And this is really where I'll talk about the methods, is what are we going to do about this G and this T in this context. So that's kind of the big overview of what we're going to try and do here. But that means, especially for those of us who have, thought a lot about interference problem before, it introduces this key quantity, which is called a network adjacency matrix or an interference mapping. And in air pollution, this would be called a source receptor matrix. But in our context, this will be a weighted bipartite adjacency matrix where we have power plants down the row, zip codes across the columns. And the interior entries of this matrix is going to denote how strong the jth power plant influences the ith zip code. And so what we're going to try and do here is model the entries of this matrix in a way that we can characterize uncertainty about what this matrix looks like and propagate that uncertainty into our causal estimates. That's the idea. So there's I think a worthwhile distinction here to pause on, which is that the interference here being driven by this physical process actually makes a lot of this problem look quite a bit different than what are, or at least were, the most common types of interference problems that were considered. So I still think it's probably true that the most commonly when people are talking about causal inference with interference, they're talking about a problem that can be framed as some sort of like social network or infection network or something like this, where we have our units organized in an adjacency network, and there's some dependency among their outcomes that leads to interference, and that structure is usually given. It's like part of the data collection, or it's treated as known, or it's fixed, or something like that. I'd say that's most commonly the setting that where there's been methods development here. The power plant setting is a little bit different because, as I've been saying, we have this physical process that's generating the interference. So there's nothing about dependent outcomes here. It's more about a complex exposure dependencies, or like treatment diffusion, sometimes this would be called, where we have this physical or geographical process dictating the structure of interference, and that structure is unknown, which means it's uncertain, or it might be inherently stochastic. So that's, I think, an important distinction to keep in mind with most of the other literature on causal inference with interference. And so the key challenge, a key challenge to progress here is what we're going to do about specifying this type of adjacency matrix. So again, the most typical context would say you ask people if they're friends, and if they report being friends, they get, you enter a 1 in the corresponding entry in that matrix, but it's usually regarded as part of the data collection. It's a fixed thing that we know, and that's the structure of this type of adjacency matrix. In the power plant context, the entries of this matrix, remember, are going to encode the influence of the jth power plant on the ith location, and this is going to be regarded as something that we model with uncertainty. I can pause again here, Ying, if anybody happens to have entered any questions.
Thank you so much for asking. Yes, we do have a question regarding the setup of the question. The question asks whether this problem can be studied using graphones.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to the
Okay,
question.
cool.
All right, it sounds like a good question.
Yeah.
Hopefully that maybe whoever asked that question can sort of think about it again after I talk a little bit more about the physical process here. But yeah, I don't have an answer. Okay, so now I'll start talking about what we're going to do here to estimate this physical process interference structure. So this is really an aside. Here's that cartoon again. The first way we made progress doing this was with what I call an engineering approach, where we basically developed this air quality model to do this, published a bunch of papers trying to do this. They're listed here. That's what this cartoon is actually meant to represent. So we did make a lot of progress on this problem. There's some references there using more computational engineering type approaches. So I'll just kind of mention that as an aside. If folks are interested, there are some papers there documenting the development of that and how we've used it, although only one of those is in a statistics journal. But I'm going to talk, this project I'm talking about today represents a statistical approach to this problem. So when I first started thinking about this problem several years ago, as a statistician, I thought, well, we have a lot of data on power plants, ambient pollution, wind vectors, weather. Like, we should be able to estimate where the pollution is going over time and space, so that if we intervene in this point in space, can we measure the impacts downwind or something like that. So that's how I actually wanted to solve this problem. Again, as a statistician, when I first got involved, a lot of engineers looked me dead in the face and told me I was crazy, that it was too complicated. You could never characterize the dynamics with data. You needed physical models, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a little bit of a cautionary note. But we did finally, and this is really where Nathan Weichel entered the equation here, we did finally make some progress doing this with a statistical model, a space-time process dynamic model for linking the emissions at power plants to PM2.5 concentrations in a way that acknowledged and could then propagate the uncertainty in this interference structure. That development is really split across two papers. This one I'm focusing on today, and then one that Nathan led as part of his dissertation several years ago, that really focuses more on the spatial mechanistic model. And so this is really where we'll focus now. And so I'll describe try to describe that type of model and then how we fold it into the broader causal inference approach. So we had a lot of other data on features of this problem, which I'll outline quickly. So one ancillary data source we had was this remote sense surface of annual sulfate concentrations measured across the study region. Where exactly these come from is not that important, but sulfate would be the atmospheric constituent that's most closely related to power plant pollution. That's why sulfate is important here. So we get this annual surface of sulfate. We also know the locations of the power plants, and we measure the emissions at the power plants. So that's what those dots are, with the size of the dot relative to how much that plant emits. And then on top of that, we have, from a sort of standard weather reanalysis data source, annual wind fields. So like average wind vectors for the year that we were studying, which I don't think I said is 2016. So with these data sources, we're going to try and learn the dynamics of how the pollution is moving through space. So the way that we did that, I thought I had something else. No, the way that we did that is that I'll show you how we did that, is that we model this process with a stochastic partial differential equation that is meant to essentially have these four basic features. It's supposed to reflect a setting where SO2 is emitted from the locations of the power plants. That's point one. Point two says that SO2 starts to get blown around with the wind and diffuse and advect across space. That's feature two. Feature three is some of that SO2 then reacts to become SO4, and that SO4 then blows across space according with the wind, and then eventually gets deposited out of the atmosphere. And then we want to entail some randomness to reflect other fluctuations by things that are not part of the model. So these are sort of the four features we're going to try to maintain in this approach. And there's actually quite a consequential detail here that I'll mostly skip over, which is that we don't actually observe the temporal dynamics of these things, at least not with these data sources I've described. We only get these annual summaries of these data. So we have to try to back out the temporal dynamics using only an annual summary. And that's really what one of those papers that I'll mention again focuses on. So here's what those SPDs look like. And I'm not going to go through the details of all these specifications, but this is a coupled advection diffusion process where we have two different partial differential equations here, one corresponding to SO2 and the other one corresponding to sulfate. And so if we just look at this one here, we have, I'll start with R. This is saying a certain amount of emissions that are coming out of the power plants. That's what R represents. And then there's this advection diffusion process that basically says how these emissions are blown across the wind. And then in the second coupled part of the process, we have, this is new from the first part of the process, the SO2 emissions, which are then converting into SO4, and then a separate advection diffusion process for how the SO4 is moving across, is diffusing across space and blowing with the wind. And so the way these are specified entail a lot of other assumptions that I won't dwell on, but just to give you a flavor for what these types of mechanistic models look like. So solving SPDs like this is a big challenge, and this is really where this paper that really Nathan and Ephraim Hanks led from a few years ago comes in. Is it turns out that if you adopt a discrete space approximation to this problem, you can formulate this as an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, and what that really means is it gives you a framework to obtain a Gaussian likelihood for the spatial data, where both the mean and the variance are dictated by the process dynamics of those SPDs. And then once you get there, you can develop an MCMC algorithm to make inference on these parameters. So in some ways, the punchline of this that I'll pause on for a second is that formulating the model in this way, you can obtain a Gaussian likelihood for the power plant pollution, the sulfate, eta, where the mean of that distribution is, and the variance of that the covariance matrix of that distribution are dictated by these parameters theta, which are governed by those SPDEs that I had on the previous slide. And so what you have here is, well, I'll say a little bit more about it on as we go here, because I want to draw out one point here, which again, for people, sort of like I was when I got into this, who are not used to thinking about spatial statistics and problems, is that there's a very important feature of the mechanistic nature of this model that is essential for the causal inference objective we're trying to solve here. So I'll try and elaborate on that. Most spatial statistics approaches are sometimes referred to as phenomenological. They're basically about taking some observed measurements at points in space and then trying to interpolate a surface. And so those types of models, they're not designed to inform how pollution moves from location to location. You can almost think of those as there's really more about a problem of spatial correlation. You're trying to model the spatial correlation in some surface, in some observations that are part of some surface, which may be difficult and important, but is going to be of limited use for characterizing the structure of interference. So if you're thinking about spatial statistics as just like spatially correlated error models, that's not going to get the job done for this problem. So the model that I've just tried to outline here is a mechanistic statistical model, which means we have these dynamics specified as part of the SPDE. And what it allows us to do is make inferences on how changes to emissions at a single point in space change the entire surface. So the dynamics end up in the mean structure of that Gaussian, which is actually has very strong implications because it's going to allow us to use that Gaussian to then characterize the interference structure. And that's what I'll say about in a second. So I wanted to pause on that. So here's what we actually do. So here's that Gaussian likelihood we get out of those SPDEs. The vector R is the emissions at various points in space corresponding to the power plants. So we can input a level of emissions R here, and what will be output is like a posterior predicted surface under that emission scenario. And so what that allows us to do is kind of go one power plant at a time and say, we're going to take the power plant J, and we're going to predict what the pollution surface would be if the Jth power plant emitted 1,000 tons of SO2 and none of the other power plants emitted anything. And what that will help us to do is isolate the impact on this whole pollution surface that's attributable to just that Jth power plant. So that's what this figure on this map on the right is meant to show you. That black dot is a power plant, and this represents the sort of posterior predictive surface when that power plant is emitting and none of the other power plants are emitting. Nothing says it has to be like a circle like that. There's nothing that says it has to be symmetric. That's just what it looks like for this power plant. So what we do is we can go through that for all the power plants and use that to directly specify the interior entries of this adjacency matrix. There's a technical thing here about averaging over the areas of the zip codes because the observational units there are shapes, they're not points, but that's sort of a technical thing. The main point is that we can use this mechanistic model here to then extract entries of our weighted adjacency matrix that encode how influential the Jth power plant is on the ith location. And that's really what we were after with this. So let me just say a couple things, and I can pause again for questions, Ying, if there are any. So what we've done here is we've taken these ancillary data sources, we've estimated the process dynamics of air pollution, and used that directly to specify an interference structure. All of this will happen with statistical uncertainty. Then we're going to take that statistical uncertainty and plug that into an approach to estimate causal effects with that statistical uncertainty in the interference structure. So yeah, I'll pause there now, Ying, if there were any questions about that part.
Thank you, Corwin, for asking. We do have an active question, but I have seen Nathan answering it, so I think we are good to continue.
That's probably better. You're in better hands with Nathan answering those questions anyway. So thank you, Nathan. Great, then I'll go on. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time. Okay. All right, so let's start talking about causal estimands again, and how we're gonna actually use those things in the investigation. So there are a lot of, in the bipartite setting, in lots of interference settings, there are many types of causal effects one could define. Here's what we're gonna do for the purposes of this talk. So if we can, in the bipartite setting, remember, we can write down the potential outcomes for the ith unit as a function of the treatment status of the Jth power plant and then some vector of treatments to all the other power plants. So if we write it this way, we have to keep track of the fact that this can be defined for every ij pair. So we need to do something to put some structure on this. We're going to follow this approach where we'll formulate the problem as one of a bivariate treatment, where for each zip code I, we're going to essentially select one power plant that's of particular interest to that zip code. So here we're going to say for every zip code, we're going to select the closest power plant, geographically closest power plant, and call that the key associated power plant, denote that with this J star notation, and then call out a treatment indicator Z, which will be the treatment status of the closest power plant, of the key associated power plant. So that's the first component of the treatment. The second component of this treatment takes this exposure mapping approach, which is going to specify some function here, G, that will create a scalar summary of the treatment statuses of all of the other power plants that are not the closest power plant. And this is going to be an exposure, sometimes it's called an exposure mapping function. And one thing I want to keep track of here is it's a function of this treatment vector to the other power plants and the interference matrix, the adjacency matrix, which is now indexed by an unknown parameter theta. And so then based off this formulation of a bivariate treatment 1 and 2 here, we'll define causal effects based on potential outcomes that are indexed only by Z and G. And this is where we plug into work that's been around for a while, in particular this paper by Laura Frostieri and others. And then we have a sort of a more recent adaptation of that to the bipartite setting also. And so just to give you a sense of what it looks like in this study in Texas, here's a map of this Z, the individual level treatment or the key associated treatment. So every zip code here that's colored in that kind of greenish color is one where the closest power plant to that zip code is treated. That's the idea here. The other component of the treatment is what we call, what in the sort of social network literature might be called like a neighborhood treatment, and we call it an upwind treatment, exact same idea, where we specify this exposure mapping, which takes a vector of zeros and ones and an interference matrix and translates it into, in this case, a scalar quantity. The function we use here is written there. It's not worth following in so much detail. It's essentially just a weighted average of the treatments at upwind power plants, where those weights are dictated by the edge weights in the adjacency matrix. That's what G is. But again, because our network adjacency matrix now is indexed by an unknown parameter theta, any uncertainty in theta will be propagated into this neighborhood or upwind treatment value. And so this is what it looks like if we color the zip codes according to like the posterior mean estimate of the upwind treatment in the study area. Okay, and so as with this sort of methodology that relies on the bivariate treatment, there is really the key assumption about the interference can be expressed like this. We say that the potential outcome at a location under any two treatment vectors A and A prime is the same as long as Z and G are the same. So this is the assumption that basically says all of the interference kind of flows through this key associated treatment Z and this summary function G. So this is it. Like, this is the key assumption that is made about interference in approaches like this. And the importance of this assumption, at least to me, was one of the key motivations for coming up with methods to incorporate uncertainty in parts of this process. So I would say for these methods that are based on exposure mappings, like their key strength is they give a framework to reduce the structure of these interference problems to something that we can make progress with. Like, that's a strength. I'd say a key limitation is that like everything hinges on the specification of that exposure mapping G. And so to me, that's an argument for trying to model this and incorporate uncertainty in it, because really everything comes down to what we specify. All of these key assumptions will depend on what we specify as this exposure mapping function G. And I think that this is particularly important in these interference problems that are driven by these physical processes. Like there's a chance for this G to actually mean something that has some sort of interpretation. It's not just like a convenient summary. And given its importance, it makes sense to model it and acknowledge uncertainty in it. That's sort of one of the motivations here. Let's see here. I'm going to sort of skip over that. So, okay. So what are the causal effects we're going to focus on, at least for this talk for now? One will be direct effects. I think that have most correspondence to what are called of direct effects, which are as written here. It's just the average comparison under potential outcomes when the closest power plant Z is treated versus not being treated for a fixed specified level of the upwind treatment. So that's sometimes known as a direct effect, which we can average over the distribution of the upwind treatment G and get something that's sort of like the average effect on pediatric asthma of installing a scrubber on the closest power plant. That's how we would interpret something like this. The other estimand we'll talk about today will be something that's more like an indirect effect, or we could call it an upwind effect in this case. And that'll be the average comparison of changing the level of treatments located upwind from G to 0. Doesn't have to be 0, it could be something else, for a fixed level of the treatment status of the closest power plant. And we could similarly average this over the observed distribution of this upwind treatment. And this is something like the average effect on pediatric asthma of installing more scrubbers upwind from a location. That's how we would interpret this. How are we doing, Ying? Any questions that I should pause and try and answer?
Again, we got some questions, but Nathan have been answering them excellently. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm very glad you were able to join. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about how we actually do the estimation here, and bring all of these things together. So there is an ignorable treatment assumption here, of course, right? There's an observational study. The form of that assumption is kind of the usual form of that assumption. The only wrinkle being here is that we have some characteristics that are characteristics of the zip codes that might be confounders, some characteristics that are characteristics of the power plants that might be confounders. And so we define these summary functions of power plant characteristics. But I'd characterize that as a minor detail. I'll say what types of confounders we had available in this context in a minute, just to give an idea. But the way we bring all these things together here is with this modular Bayesian estimation approach. So you can think of it as this like a two-step Bayesian approach. So the first step is we have this sulfate process model. This is what is all derived from those SPDEs. So we can obtain posterior distribution of the parameters of this model up here in number 1. And it's the outputs from this model that dictate the interference matrix and the upwind treatment. So when we obtain a posterior distribution for the unknown parameters of this model, it induces a posterior distribution on the network adjacency matrix and on the upwind treatment values G. So we get a whole posterior distribution of the upwind treatments. So that's the first stage. The second stage is the sort of outcome modeling stage, for which we adopt a log linear BART specification for the rate of mortality or emergency department visits, depending on which outcome we're talking about. That is a function of these two treatment variables and then a long vector of covariates. But if we obtain then the posterior distribution of this outcome model, we can use predictions from that model to calculate all of the contrasts that make up the causal effects that we're interested in. So the idea here is we obtain it's not a fully Bayesian analysis. We modularize this, so we obtain the full posterior distribution in step 1, and then we use simulations from that posterior in step 1 and plug them into step 2 to calculate posterior distribution in step 2. So that will propagate the uncertainty in step 1 of this approach into our causal estimates that come from step 2, but it will do so in a way that is not going to let any of the quantities in step 2 somehow like pollute what we want to learn about the pollute, I didn't mean a joke, somehow influence the dynamics that we specified in the first step. And this is this may be familiar to folks. This comes up fairly often, I think, in these types of Bayesian models. But again, the punchline being that what we get at the end of the day is causal estimates that posterior distributions of causal estimates that incorporate that posterior uncertainty in the interference structure as dictated by the process dynamics. So let's just talk about what this looks like when we did it. So just to remind us or maybe I didn't even say what all the data sources are. I did talk about the data sources available for estimating the pollution dynamics. We have emissions data, we have annual sulfate data, we have wind vectors. The health data that we analyzed in this paper came from two different sources. For asthma, we had emergency department visits from what's called the Texas Healthcare Information Collection System. They collect emergency department visits for all the hospitals in Texas. And so that's how we could obtain a zip code level rate of asthma ED visits among children in the year of the analysis. The analysis of mortality is based on data from Medicare, where we can calculate the mortality rate of Medicare beneficiaries living in each zip code. Then there's a bunch of population demographic data that mostly comes from the census, some of it from the CDC, or used to come from the census and the CDC, and some climate data from sort of standard climate data products. So here, again, I won't dwell on all of these, but just to give you a flavor of the types of confounders we included in this analysis, it's a lot of demographic data about the location, some data on features of the power plants, some data about basically meteorology. We can come back to it if people have questions. So as we did this analysis, there were actually kind of two intertwined questions we wanted to try and answer as we did this. One was, is it actually worth it to go through all of this trouble to incorporate the interference uncertainty in analysis like that? So that's one question. And the other question is all of the work to actually implement BART for a log linear model like this, was that worth it? Like, is BART really give us something? And so there are actually kind of four versions of the analysis that I'll show you very quickly. The first couple are based on just a plain parametric Poisson regression, where within that Poisson regression for the outcome model, we did a version where we fixed the interference structure and did not incorporate uncertainty in that structure. That's what's denoted here with T theta hat. Like, we just took the posterior mean estimate of theta, found one interference matrix, and conditioned the inference on that. And then B here is actually doing what I described to you a minute ago, where we marginalize over the uncertainty in the interference process. And then we repeated those two things, sort of fixed interference structure, uncertain interference structure within the log linear BART model also. And so there are a few things that are sort of interesting. I'll try and point out some of them. So what we have here is, we have the first row here are estimates of the direct effects, and then we have two different indirect effect estimates in the other rows. The first column, these purple ones, are the inferences from the parametric Poisson regression. Very simple model. The middle column is from the log linear BART. And in both of these, we can see that the darker uncertainty intervals here correspond to the analyses where we fix the interference structure. And then the lighter colored uncertainty intervals are when we acknowledge the uncertainty in the interference structure. And we see that basically the lighter intervals are wider because there's more, I'd say, honest account of the uncertainty in the interference structure there. So these are the results for Medicare. The other thing I want to point out, which I think is sort of cool about this, is this third column here, the rightmost column. Because of the two-stage modular Bayesian estimation, this basically takes the structure of multiple imputation, which means you can calculate these sort of within and between variance components of the total estimate you get at the end. And so what that can allow you to do is quantify, as is done in the rightmost column here, the percentage of the total variation in your causal estimate that's attributed to variation in the interference structure. And here's where you see how much of your causal estimates in uncertainty is because of the uncertain nature of their interference structure. It actually depends a lot on whether you're using a very simple parametric model versus a much more flexible non-parametric model. At least for these upwind effects in the bottom two rows. So that's kind of a neat feature of the analysis, I think, or of the sort of infrastructure here. this is the same plots, but instead of for mortality, this is for asthma emergency department visits. And here you get some somewhat interesting things where if I draw your attention down to the bottom of the slide here with the BART analysis, if you don't acknowledge uncertainty in the interference structure, you get these regions of the exposure where it seems like there is a, you know, significantly different from zero causal effect of more scrubbers upwind on asthma. But when you incorporate the uncertainty in their interference structure, it actually adds quite a lot of uncertainty back in and kind of washes away the analysis. So this is like an example of where it actually does give you a different inference when you fold in this uncertainty due to the interference structure.
Corwin, if you can finish within a minute or so, that'd be great.
Perfect. Closing thoughts. Great.
Awesome.
But thank you for keeping me on track. All right, so just to kind of summarize with this is, so I think that especially in environmental sciences, there are many sort of physical systems that imply the situation where you have treatments or exposures that spill over across time and space. So I focused on this in the context of power plants and air pollution, but there are certainly other settings where this is relevant, and I think pretty different from where a lot of the statistical methods for interference were developed. So to address that, basically, we really tried to come up with methods that could, instead of treating the structure of the interference as a fixed and known thing, really try and model this and incorporate that uncertainty into the causal estimates. And that's what led us to these new methods that jointly estimate the interference structure and the causal effects. And then I have some references here. So this talk is basically this paper that's in the large type here. That's basically what I just told you about. But it relies pretty heavily on these other citations that I've listed there, some of which I was not involved in case folks are interested. All right, great. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Corwin. So given the time, maybe Fredrik, can you start the discussion? And then if time permits, maybe we can have time to ask presenters to answer the questions. But like if like we don't have time, still the questions are all going to be shared with the presenters. So don't need to be worried about it. So Fredrik?
Can you hear me now? Perfect. And you can see my slides? Great. Okay, thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for inviting me to discuss it. So I'm going to situate this paper in kind of the broader interference literature. And I think that Corey maybe was a bit generous to the previous literature, saying that in many cases we have a natural interference structure. I don't believe that to be the case. So I think the kind of state of the literature is something like this. A statistician or a methodologist says a meaningful causal inference under interference is only possible if we have knowledge of the interference structure. And then some empirical researcher asks, how can I figure out how the structure is? And then the statistician say, hey, sorry, I need to go. This is largely an open question. So we know from the current literature that causal inference under interference is possible. But as I just mentioned, for most causal inference questions under interference, we need to know and restrict the structure of the interference. And this is hard, and it's largely been ignored by the methodological literature. What Corey and co-authors have done over the past few years, not only this paper, but previous paper as well, is to explore how we can have a mechanistic understanding of, for example, in this case, the physics or the atmosphere, to infer what this interference structure is. And I think that this is not an exaggeration to call this groundbreaking, because it is tackling this most difficult question in causal inference kind of head on, whereas a lot of people, including myself, are trying to kind of move around it. Corey and co-authors are doing it head on. And this paper by Nathan and Corey is kind of the pinnacle of this research agenda, because it is including all the kind of aspects that we consider, and especially characterizing the uncertainty. So some of these things have already been discussed, but I want to kind of provide a short summary and situate it in the integrated literature. So potential outcomes without structural assumptions, then this is a map from all the possible treatments, to the treatment vectors to the reals. And we know already that causal inference is impossible here. So Guillaume and Adrioli showed this a couple of years ago. it has been shown that it is possible under weak non-structural assumptions. You don't need structural assumptions. A paper with me and some others, and also other papers have shown this. But this is for particular estimands, and these estimands are typically hard to interpret. So for most estimands, to make meaningful progress, we need these structural restrictions. We need structural restrictions on the way that the potential outcomes behaves. And the standard approach here is exposure mappings. And that is, we saw that in the talk, that is a mapping from the full treatment vector to a low dimensional space. And the key assumption here, which is the assumption that's called correctly specified exposure mapping, is that the full potential outcome function can be decomposed into one component that maps from the exposures to the reals and this exposure mapping. So we have this structure here of decomposition. And most of the time, this exposure mapping is presumed to be known, and the only thing that we need to estimate is this y tilde. So this is in the ordinary setting. Nathan and Corey focus on the bipartite setting that was developed by Corey and Georgia. The idea here with exposure mapping are essentially the same, but it is in a different setting. So the graph, so to speak, is different. And then we goes back to how do we pick these exposure mappings? We need to know them, but how do we pick them? And everyone is just hiding. There's not a good answer, I think, to this question. In some settings, it might be clear, but in most settings, it's not clear. So what empirical researchers have been told is to use their substantive knowledge to do this. And that's very easy. I've said that as well. It's very easy to say, but extremely difficult to do. And similar to the previous result, we don't need to do this exactly. It's okay to be a bit misspecified, but the interpretation becomes trickier. And it is difficult, I would argue, to get the structure even approximately right. So even if you can have some, is okay with some specification, it might be difficult to get even there. So the consequence of this is that people have just ignored the problem. And I think that this is the kind of key takeaway here, is that you don't solve misspecification by ignoring it, which I think a lot of the literature has done previously. And here we come to Corey's paper. So Corey and Nathan's paper. So sometimes we have a good understanding on a quantitative level of the mechanisms that mediate the interference. So when it comes to pollution, we know that pollution comes from, for example, coal power plants. It's mediated by the wind that creates local pollution where people live, and that local pollution leads to asthma. So we have a fairly good understanding on a kind of mechanistic quantitative level on this, but this is not an exposure mapping. So we need to be more specific to have an exposure mapping. But the idea here is, can we use this qualitative understanding to estimate the part of the exposure mapping from the mechanistic process? So basically separating out part of the exposure mapping that we have a good sense of the mechanisms, and then estimate that part, and then leave the rest for a more conventional estimation. So this is, as we saw towards the end of the talk, this is part of a larger research agenda. So Corey, with a bunch of other people, constructed a deterministic atmospheric model for this. And that was used by Corey, Vera, Fabrizia, and Laura in a recent paper where they estimate the effect of installing these scrubbers on various outcomes. And here the model is deterministic. So there is no statistical uncertainty in the model, but this is problematic partly because it's very computationally intractable, but we expect there to be uncertainty in the model. Like even if it's not statistical, there are other types of uncertainty. And that is where this paper comes in. So they provide a statistical mechanistic model that allows them to figure out part of the exposure mapping. It is computationally tractable, and more importantly, which is really the key contribution of the existing literature, which mostly is Corey's own work, is that it takes into this statistical uncertainty into account when drawing inferences. So we saw that really matters. And this is based on a previous paper with the authors and some other people. And I would say, like, really read this paper. I think this is one of the most important recent papers in causal inference on interference, exactly because it is tackling this difficult problem, like one of the most important open questions in the literature head on. And I think the most impressive part is that it's extremely interdisciplinary. It's using insights from, countless different fields, which is, a daunting task. So taking a look at the paper. I have some questions and comments. The first one is this really a bipartite graph setting? So you have this very rich atmospheric model, And then you take that model and map it onto a fairly crude weighted bipartite network. And so this is cutting from the paper. You had the similar in the slides. So we know here that the effect is mediated through these local air particles like the sulfate and so on. And your model tells you how these things is affected by, in a particular location, by various interventions, right? But you're not using that information in the exposure mapping. You have mapped this information down to this weighted bipartite network. And then when you do the causal inference, you're kind of ignoring that model. And I understand that you can't address everything in the same paper, like this is a big step already, but it seems like you're leaving a lot of information on the table. You have this rich model, but you're not using it directly in the exposure mapping. You're using it kind of in an indirect way. So it would seem natural to include this model in a more direct way into the exposures. So that's my first critique, comment, question. And the second one is, why focus on the direct and indirect effects based on key associated units? And as you discuss in the paper, the main argument, I guess, is that this is familiar estimands. This is stuff that we already seen and therefore understand. But they seem to go against one of this kind of central motivation of the paper. And that is, the first one is that we are in a bipartite setting. If it's not bipartite graph setting, it's a bipartite setting in the sense that they are the units that are treated and the outcome units are different. So we don't have a sense of a unit's own treatment. So this kind of direct effect becomes kind of artificial. And then you also say in the paper that simple distance-based methods of exposure, just looking at kind of the distance between power plants and the outcomes, is not appropriate because atmospheric conditions really affect what goes on here. So distant coal plants can be relevant. But then the key associated unit is defined to be the geographically closest power plant. That seems to go directly against that insight that atmospheric conditions matters. So there's a bunch of other, this is just some examples, but other estimates that seems of greater importance to me at least, and that's like, what's the effect in general of increasing the number of scrubbers by 10%, or installing more scrubbers, or installing scrubbers at the most polluting plants, or the effect of no scrubbers versus all scrubbers and stuff like that. So that is my second question, comment, critique, take it as well. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk, and thank you very much for the paper. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome, thank you. I think we have a few minutes, so Corey, maybe
Did
you
I
can
respond?
Yeah.
I thank you so much, Fredrik. You said some really nice things about the work, and in addition to being nice, I do really appreciate your comments that I think have correctly identified that this has grown from sort of a long time spent, working with these power plants and air pollution and the interdisciplinary nature of the work. I think that is what it has taken. I think that, as you articulated super well, I think a lot of times as statisticians we get used to saying like, well, you ask your collaborator and get a sense of what it should be, but like, good luck really explaining to your collaborator like what the implications are of what this interference actually means and what you could learn. I mean, I don't know that that exchange is very natural, and so it does, I think, require that a little bit more of a hefty interdisciplinarity to get, as a statistician, like more ingrained in some of the other areas of the science. So I particularly appreciate that you highlighted that. In terms of your questions, I'll do my best to try and answer them. So the first one is about, really what we have is like there's some components of the air pollution that are mediating the relationship that I'm characterizing as interference here. And so why don't we use what we know about that mediating relationship directly instead of kind of back out these adjacency weights, which is a very good question. I think there are a couple of things that I'll sort of attempt to respond to that. One is that it's a little bit difficult in this sense. There's a detail in here where what we're trying to measure here is sort of like the potential influence of taking an action at one point in space and its impact on some other point in space. And the reason I use the word potential is because if you put the scrubber on, you take out all the SO2. And so if you really try to measure all of those like downstream dynamics of that, you get something that effectively looks like adjusting for a post-treatment variable, right? So it really would require like a full mediation consideration here, which is a good thought, but that was sort of the reason why that's sort of a partial answer to your question. In terms of a finer grade detail, you know, for those who looked carefully at the paper, like that's why in that expression you showed it's 1,000, like you estimate the emissions being 1,000 tons of SO2 at each power plant. That 1,000 is arbitrary. It's meant to make a notion of connection in the network that is puts all the power plants on like sort of a level playing field. So you're measuring like the potential influence. So, but it's a good question. And I was sort of skimming the chat here as you were talking, and somebody asked a question about the temporal dynamics here, like all of this stuff varies over time. And so I think, and which is something we've started to think about a lot. And I think that's where maybe we might have to make more use of these like mediating data things to really try and pin down the parts of the problem that matter as it evolves over time. So that's not really an answer other than to your question, but it is something that we've thought about, and I'm not sure exactly what to do about. You asked a good question about like what's the point of the key.
Thank you, Corey. Sorry to interrupt, but I think we are running out of the time, so maybe we can talk about it offline.
Sure.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Okay, So first, thank you so much, both Corey and Fredrik, for the wonderful talk and then discussions. And as I said, there are several like open questions still, but like those going to be shared with Corey and the co-authors, and we can also keep it offline for more discussions. But next week, we're going to have Eric Jetkins talking about revisiting identification in the binary instrumental laudable models. So hope you're going to join the online Causal Inference seminar next week as well. So thank you so much all.